We interview the founder of Impact Speech and Debate Coaching. We discuss some of the common themes to expect this debate season, and we reveal the case Steve and I won our first tournament with this year. Stay tuned. We've got a lot of fun discussions this week. Okay, Elijah, I think you had a very important question first and foremost for Matthew.
Okay, Matthew.
Take it away.
For those who don't know who Matthew is, he started Impact Debate Speech and Coaching, and they give excellent services regarding team policy debating, coaching, and they sell brief subscriptions and such like that. Today, I'll be interviewing him. How are you doing today, Matthew?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. Firstly, our most important question: what is your favorite Beatles song?
My favorite Beatles song? Unfortunately, I am not a huge fan of the Beatles. I'm not even sure I can name one of their songs actually. Um, I do enjoy a little Yellow Submarine every now and again.
That's a good one.
That is a good one.
Elijah's our Beatles fan of the club.
Can you explain? I explained a little bit. Can you explain fully what your company services and provides for TP debaters?
Absolutely. So the number one service that we provide is our personalized coaching. And that's kind of how I got into all of this is I started coaching a number of team policy debaters at various tournaments and throughout the season. So what we do at Impact is we can come alongside any debate team or individual debater and we can help them with individual questions with our Quick Coach, which is a free option that we offer where you just you just ask a quick question over email and we give you a quick answer in return. I've actually had a couple of those this week. We also provide individual coaching on a week-to-week basis for teams that want just that added supplement of a little bit more expert advice. And then we also do, when convenient or when practical, we come along during tournaments and we'll coach round by round. Other than that, we also provide, like you mentioned earlier, we publish briefs that can be accessed through our membership, which is $45 for a season. We put out 10 briefs as well as 3 affirmative cases. And with that membership, you also get discounts on our coaching services. And that's just the debate side. We also have a speech side. We offer script editing, personalized coaching as far as delivery and stuff like that. And that side of the company is actually headed up by my sister, who was a decorated speech competitor in high school and actually teaches speech for a living.
Awesome. Okay, I think you already answered actually our next question. But what influenced you, just out of curiosity, to start Impact Debate Coaching, kind of taking that outside of just personal high school debate to kind of the next level? Was it just sort of an interest with debate and wanting to stay in it?
Yeah, it was kind of accidental. My first year out of high school, I still wanted to be involved as far as helping out at tournaments and things like that. And I would have different people come up to me with questions throughout debate tournaments or after I judged around. I usually try to put my email address on there if they want to follow up with questions about the ballot or about the round or just debate in general. And I had a number of people contact me about that. And so I realized I was starting to do some coaching just for free on the side. And I thought, hey, why not make a business out of this? And the response has been really, really great. I've coached a number of team policy teams, either consistently throughout a season or just here and there when they need help. I've hosted a couple of debate camps that have gone really well. And then the membership is something new we started this year, and that's really taken off. So it was kind of by accident. I was just kind of doing it because people were asking for it, and then thought, hey, why not make this a little bit more organized and actually make a business out of it? And I think it's gone really well so far.
Awesome, really cool.
Nice.
Okay, so this is getting to, I guess, the meat of the issue this year with debate is what are your thoughts about this year's resolution? And are there any certain cases or any certain things that you really like to see that have come out of this resolution?
Sure, I actually love this resolution, and when I saw it on the ballot back last spring, I thought it was a great choice and one I would have voted for if I'd if I'd had a vote in the issue. I think that one thing that people kind of overlook is that there's three major outlooks when it comes to foreign aid, and people usually either take this as assumed or don't even think about it. And we talked about this actually at our debate camp that we hosted with Impact early this past fall. We were talking about affirmative cases. And those three outlooks are, number one, the more conservative outlook of we should use foreign aid in order to further U.S. interests abroad. Then there's the second kind of liberal sway on the subject, which is that we should use foreign aid as a humanitarian help. And if we can help, we should help. And we have a moral obligation to help if we are able. And then the third outlook is really more of a libertarian kind of perspective, which is that foreign aid should be done as little as possible, and more in the interest of national defense. And we should only kind of do it when our hand is forced. And even though I label those as conservative, liberal, and libertarian, they don't necessarily always align with a particular political party. You can have a person who usually votes Republican and has that kind of leaning, but still be a liberal as far as when it comes to their perspective on foreign aid.
Or you could have like a Rand Paul who takes the stance that we should cut off aid to 90% of the countries we give it to.
Exactly.
Right. Awesome. Okay. And are there any certain cases that you've seen that obviously that you can talk about that you think are really interesting or really good, or some cases that are not so good this year? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I've only been to one team policy tournament so far this year. I've been to a couple Parley ones, but from what I've seen, the cases so far have seemed kind of on the weak side, a little bit unimaginative.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't wild about some of the ones that I saw regarding Ebola. I also have not been wild about the Peace Corps cases that I've seen. But I think there's some potential with some of the food aid requirements and shipping requirements. We did write a case on that, but also Monument put out a brief on that. And I've also seen some individuals come up with their own cases on that issue. And I think there's some potential there, but I would like to see the cases kind of branch out more and have a little bit more variety. Because so far the cases I've seen have been on the weaker side and pretty standard, not too unexpected.
Right. Interesting.
Definitely agree. Matthew, what would you say in general from all of your years of experience with debate? Is there like a leading philosophy that you go into debate with, or a mindset that you always try to like wrap your cases around, if that makes any sense?
Sure. There's a number of philosophies, and they really apply to different aspects of debate. The number one is just always come in with a positive attitude that you're always going to do the best you can, and you're always going to find a way to have a successful debate. The most damaging philosophy someone can have is a philosophy of uncertainty, of unease, not knowing what's going to happen. Usually when a debate team comes in intimidated or unsure, then their performance usually is affected by that. The second one I would say is always come in trying to have the best debate. Not necessarily always trying to do anything possible to win, but trying to come in with looking for the opportunity to have the best clash. Because great debaters are looking for clash and will actually create a interesting debate on the issues rather than just trying to speed and spread or trying to win on technicality or something like that. Nobody enjoys watching those kinds of debates.
Right, definitely
I can agree with that. What are the day-to-day responsibilities as in IDSC? What do they look like?
The day-to-day responsibilities at IDSC. That's an interesting question because I've just spent yesterday doing a lot of stuff for the business. On a day-to-day basis, it usually involves preparing for the tutoring and classes that I teach. Right now, I teach a debate class at the Y that encompasses both public forum, policy, and maybe a little bit of parley if we can get to it. I also do some private tutoring with some students, both in public forum and team policy. So that's most of the kind of week-to-week activities, is preparing for those kinds of classes or tutoring sessions. And then if I have a free weekend or so, I'm usually spending that time researching or editing briefs that my other contributors send me, and updating the website and things like that. So right now, Matthew Dunmeyer has been contributing a number of our briefs and been helping with that. Jonathan Fuller is also involved, and he's working on an affirmative case for me, so we've been collaborating on some of that. So day to day, it's mostly just preparing for lessons, editing briefs, talking to people who are interested in services, and making edits on the website.
It sounds like you're pretty busy.
Yeah, it does keep me busy, but it's nice that it's something that I enjoy and don't mind doing, which kind of keeps the joy in it.
What's the
Awesome.
hardest thing that you do out of all your
In regards to
responsibilities?
impact?
Yeah.
The hardest thing is probably integrating new students on the tutoring basis and that side of the issue, because I get a lot of people who come in, sometime during the season. They've started, a lot of them are new. They've started debate that year that they're contacting me, and they've realized that they want some sort of supplement to what they're getting at their club or at home or something like that. And so that can be difficult to integrate those new students, because I'm not sure where they're at as far as their skills, as far as their knowledge, as far as what they're looking for. So it can be a little bit difficult to get on the same page and to find out what they need and what they're looking for from Impact. Then once we get through that and maybe meet and talk, or I can watch maybe one of their debates if they've recorded one, then it gets easier from there. But that's probably the most difficult aspect of operating Impact debate.
I gotcha. All right, so here's a fun question I love asking all debaters that I meet. What is the kookiest or the most bizarre thing you've either ever heard of or had to run against in debate?
Wow. That is a great question. And I was in debate for 5 years, so I could probably give you a list of kooky things I saw, or things that people wouldn't believe unless they were there. Some things that stick out in my mind. There was one time someone was running a case involving planting a computer virus in North Korea's missile program, except they had no idea how they were actually going to physically get the computer virus in the system. Their limited explanation was that they were going to send over a special operations group to do it, in their own words. And then when we pressed them on that, one of the greatest cross-ex quotes I will ever remember is they said, "That is unnecessary details."
What?
Yeah, so that was quite interesting, and it's always rewarding when the judge gets it all and writes it down on the ballot and says, "The affirmative team sunk their case with the quote unnecessary details." So that was quite interesting. And there have been other things where people running out in the middle of the round because they got sick. Unfortunate, but definitely memorable. One time I was going against a debater who was able to close a window, walk over to the other side of the classroom and close a window
No
while
way.
continuing his speech and not missing a beat.
That's mad
Really?
skills.
Wasn't that the older Darren?
That
Darren's
was
older brother?
Lance. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
yeah. Lance. That's funny.
To Lance Stevens. And then the last one I'll mention is one time we had gone against the same team 4 times in a season. And after one of the rounds, a judge had explained how they could maybe argue against our case better. And in the next round, they referenced that judge as an argument and argued that because that judge said they could win the argument, that they should win that argument, even though that they had no evidence to
What?
support it.
What?
Oh my goodness. Was that John Sharp?
No, it was. I will say it was a Lynchburg team, but I'll keep them anonymous.
I used to
Oh,
live in
okay.
Lynchburg. Yeah, they're pretty crazy over there.
Lynchburg is amazing. Steven and I kind of got adopted by Lynchburg, so that was fun.
Yeah, Lynchburg is a second home. So
Yep, always. Awesome.
Can
Wow, I love these crazy debate stories. Elijah, I think you had another question.
can you tell me something that you think's true that almost nobody agrees with you, Matthew?
something that I think is true that nobody agrees with me.
Almost nobody.
Do I have to be specific to debate, or is that a general question?
Well, specific to debate would be nice, but I mean,
Sure.
if you don't have one like that, just like something that you think that is different from other people.
Sure. So, I believe that splitting the negative is the most unethical form of debate, and
No way.
I used it quite often. I come with the idea that the affirmative team should be as prepared as possible, and it should focus on the issues. And splitting the negative is very effective because it kind of creates the effect of speed and spread without actually speeding and spreading. But it can also lead to a diluted 1AR, which kind of usually leaves the debate in tatters once you get to the rebuttals because everybody's just going point by point and trying to cover everything so nothing gets dropped. And I think it makes for a better debate if all of the stock issue arguments are brought up in the 1NC and maybe just disadvantages are added in the 2NC. And I know most people disagree with me on that quite profusely. And I know why, because the negatives aren't always prepared, but I think it's a lot of times used as a crutch for not being prepared.
Interesting. Awesome. Okay. Let's see. I think you already answered the next question we had, but going down to sort of a final or almost final question. When you approach debate, what are some of your values that you try to represent in the debate room? Whether that's, as a debater when you're in high school, or whether that's from your standpoint now, what you're trying to impress on debaters. What would some of those values be?
Sure. So the biggest one to me, I touched on a little bit earlier, is that the debate is more about creating good clash rather than actually winning the round. Yes, we want to win. Yes, we want to do well. But that will happen if we have good clash and if we do it the right way. So I always emphasize to students and debaters who I judge that the most important thing is to have a good debate, to understand the issues, and to go down multiple levels in refutation. So that's the biggest thing. The second thing would just be, and it kind of follows along with that, is to always be honest. It's perfectly fine to answer "I don't know" to something you don't know. And you're always going to be rewarded for being honest. If you try to skirt around the edges and try to avoid things in a manner that really isn't upfront, then you'll always end up paying for it at some point down your debate career.
I got it.
Definitely.
Completely agree. All right, one last question for you. You used to be a very successful debater, and now you're from like the coaching / judging position. I'm not sure if you can summarize this into like one point, but what would be one thing that debaters could do that would increase their judging points or speaker points?
Absolutely. So I love the rubric that CCFSE uses on the ballot. I think those are great categories to go by, and I don't think debaters look at those often enough and ask themselves how they're doing in each of those categories. For me, I know the biggest comment I put down on debate ballots is that refutation issue that I just mentioned a little bit earlier, but I can talk about it a little bit more now. Going down multiple levels in refutation. A lot of times debaters will make the initial argument on their side of the issue, and then they'll just kind of go back and forth repeating that issue. But great debaters will go down multiple levels each speech. So once the negative team makes the argument in the 1NC, the affirmative should be responding to the argument in the 1NC. And then in the 2NC, the negative team needs to be responding to the 2AC argument rather than just repeating their argument. And what I see a lot of times, especially with first, second, and third year debaters, is they make a good initial argument and then they just repeat it the rest of the round. And then it just becomes a competition of which one had a bigger impression on the judge. Whereas debaters who are good at refutation will dig into each response and create their own response to that specific response so that the argument is actually progressing and going somewhere.
That's really good.
I have one question left for you. This is kind of a little bit off topic, but would you be willing to buy a brief for me once I'm done with it?
To buy a brief from you?
Yep. It's a squirrel case about squirrels.
About squirrels.
About squirrels. Are we talking about like squirrel cases?
Yes, it's a squirrel case about squirrels.
Okay. Well, I always welcome new contributors for Impact. So if that's something you're interested in doing, I'm always free to talk about that. Always looking for new people so that lightens the load kind of on me so I can focus more on the coaching side. So if it's a case that's well thought out and the brief is something that could be relevant to our subscribers, then I'd be happy to look into it.
Okay.
Awesome.
I like it.
I believe.
Okay. All right. Well, I think let's see. We have definitely a few more questions for you, Matthew. But first, a quick word from our sponsor this week. So, Nerdsy offers cheap and innovative web design services, working with WordPress and Shopify to deliver clients with quick and hassle-free website development that keeps you on budget and on time. Site development starts at just around $200, and you can start anytime just by reaching out to the folks at Nerdsy. You can find them online at www.nerdsy.net, or better yet, you can follow them on Instagram at nerd.zy. They work with WordPress and Shopify. They have experience building e-commerce websites, company websites, and so much more. Be sure and check them out today. Their work is really fantastic. I know because I'm involved with them, and I am heavily biased on this, but I can say that. So be sure and check them out. Again, nerdsy.net or Instagram at nerd.zy. You can shoot them a DM. You can shoot them an email. Either way, whatever works best for you, and they'll get back to you quickly. So moving down to some questions, which I think we've covered a lot already, but this is on a slightly different twist. So some philosophies or common themes in debate this year. Matthew, you already covered sort of the liberal, conservative, libertarian philosophies, but there are some common themes that personally I've noticed in debate this year, and those are human rights and sort of military oppression. I think that's going to be a big one this year. Efficiency and effectiveness with things like shipping or with the administration of aid, whether that's in the form of cash or in the form of in-kind contributions. Dealing with starvation in poverty-stricken countries or countries that are stricken by famine, and fighting AIDS through programs like PEPFAR. Those are all common themes that I think we're going to see a lot of cases off of. I'm curious, Matthew, I know you've only been to one tournament, so that'll be a little bit limiting, but based off just some of the literature you've seen, do you see the potential for some bigger topics or some bigger dogs in the fight, I guess you'd say, with regard to some of these case themes? Or do you think that pretty much summarizes the scope of this resolution?
That's a great question, and I think there's a lot more to be explored that people aren't necessarily looking into. I would love to spend even more time on this, and I think I will this coming spring once I go to some more tournaments and get the juices flowing. But people do usually pile on to the similar type cases that they see other people running, and I think that's why we see such a narrow focus with such a broad um, debate resolution. I think an interesting thing that people aren't looking at as much is the U.S. involvement in international organizations. There's a lot of NGOs that the U.S. is involved with that spend millions, if not billions, of dollars, and would fit well within the context of foreign aid. And I don't think those are being explored as well as they could be. We could also talk about the U.S. involvement with the UN. We do a lot of foreign aid through the UN. In fact, we provide over 20% of the UN budget, which most of which would fall within that category. So I think there's a lot more to be explored in those areas, as well as the economic side of foreign aid. You know, there's three major categories in foreign aid: military, humanitarian, and economic. And I feel like most of the cases that have been written so far are focusing on the military and the humanitarian because those are more attractive, have a little bit more bling, a little more bang when you're talking about them. But the economic side of it can be quite large. And so I think there's a lot more to be explored in that category as well.
Awesome. Interesting. And that kind of leads me to a follow-up question, because you mentioned things like international NGOs, the United Nations, things like that. And that's something that I know looking into that, I see a lot of potential, but at the same time, whenever you're dealing with something like aid and you know, all of foreign aid, the federal budget is something around $50 billion or so. And you know, I see things like international organizations that get $100 million, which yes, is arguably a significant amount of money, but in the scope of things, doesn't seem that significant. What kind of scale would you use this year under this resolution for measuring whether or not a case is significant when it seems like aid is so split up into so many different programs? And yes, there's a big pot of it, but each individual program doesn't necessarily get that much. How would you, what weighing mechanism would you use for that?
Sure. So a lot of people are going to get sucked into we have to use the entire foreign aid budget of the U.S. as our weighing mechanism for is something significant. And again, I think that's really limiting. I think depending on your case, you can choose a weighing mechanism that works more for you. You have to find something that says, is this something worth talking about? And that's what significance really kind of devolves into. Is significance is about the issues that we're bringing up in this debate. Are they worth bringing up? And so if you look at that, we can look at lives. We can look at lives impacted. And we could talk about, you know, even just, you know, say 100,000 people. If something like that number of people is impacted, then we can maybe count it as significance. And you can utilize cross-examination in order to build that base and create that agreement with the negative team when talking about significance, or even with the affirmative team if you're coming at it from the neg side of asking, okay, if we can make 100,000 people's lives better, would that be worth talking about? Or even talking about maybe even breaking the foreign aid budget down into more specific categories. Like if we were talking about maybe $30 million that we use for a specific program, if we could take, you know, 50% of that and put it to better use and be more efficient, would that be significant? So I think the key for affirmatives who are talking about these smaller programs in context of the overall budget need to make sure that they're not just agreeing carte blanche to the argument that we should be measuring it within the percentage of the overall budget. I think that's way too limiting. And I think we can develop some of these other mechanisms through cross-examination and in more of a maybe even a common man kind of appeal of saying, if we were talking about this with someone on the street, they would say this is important.
Right.
Yeah,
Definitely.
That's really
it
good.
seems that it stems a bit from the word substantial being kind of a relative term depending on who you're talking to. So so it kind of goes into many places. You can take it many places, like you said, Matthew.
Right. And I see a lot of people too get confused between substantial as a part of the resolution and significance as a stock issue. Substantial change within the context of the resolution is really talking about are we making a noticeable change in policy that is different enough that it can be differentiated from other things that we're doing in the status quo. It's not just adding a comma here or a word there or changing something so small that it wouldn't really be noticeable. And so therefore it's not really worth talking about. And then the impacts of that policy is where the significant stock issue comes into play. So you could have, a substantial change in policy that has no significant impact on the way things work. Or you could have a policy that really isn't that substantial as far as a change, but has far-reaching impacts. That one's a little bit more rare. But I see a lot of people get that confused when debating.
Definitely.
So Matthew, we didn't have this scheduled to ask, but considering we have the master of debate on our podcast, I'm just gonna go ahead and ask it. So this is under topic of topicality, and Christian and I have discussed this a little bit because going into the year we both had different views. But on the subject of foreign aid, we were kind of arguing about the way that we should interpret foreign aid. And going into the year, I first thought that, I'm trying to think of how to explain this without confusing myself, but foreign aid should be looked at as two different words, like aid that is foreign, instead of looking into it as like foreign aid being one word that's defined as like economic aid to another country, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's a way, and I know most, if not all, debate cases have looked at foreign aid as one word, but is there a way to write a case looking at foreign aid, instead of looking at foreign aid, looking at it as aid that is foreign? If that makes sense.
Sure. Could you give me maybe an example of something that you're thinking of that would be aid that is foreign as opposed to foreign aid?
Yeah, give me just one section. Actually, just wrote a brief, try to clarify. So like the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines aid as to provide with it useful or necessary in achieving an end or the act of helping someone. So you would define two different words inside of your definition at the beginning of your case, like aid and foreign, instead of the usual definition, which is, give me just 1 second to pop this up, which is usually on the lines of assistance such as economic aid provided by one nation to another. So you would maybe say, I don't know, can you think of an example, Christian? Like maybe instead of having to involve under like U.S. aid, you would instead...
it might make it a little bit easier using that standard to include something such as, for example, intelligence sharing or some sort of military cooperation, which might technically be a military alliance, not really an aid program, but so something that's not classified by the federal government as aid, but it effectively is the same thing.
Sure. So it sounds like kind of what you're going along the lines of is aid more defined as help, maybe, and not necessarily defined as we are giving something with no expectation of return.
Exactly. Said it better than I did.
Yeah, I am a fan of, first of all, looking at how the U.S. government defines foreign aid, because that's who we're talking about. That's the agency that we're given in this resolution. So we want to see what they define it as. If that's not possible, or if that doesn't fit what we're doing, then I am definitely in the camp of defining it together more often than not, because I think that gives a better context to what we're talking about. For example, a few years ago, we had electronic surveillance as a topic, as a resolution. And I think when you define the word separately, it certainly leads to a broader context for the resolution. As you guys are mentioning, there are cases that fit under the resolution better if you define the word separately as opposed to together. But I believe the intention of the resolution is to provide a framework within debaters to work and to research. And so when we take foreign aid together, we know that foreign is an adjective used to describe the aid that the kind of framers of the resolution were intending.
Yeah.
So I think that the adjectives, the descriptive adjectives, are really important because they're there for a reason. And so therefore, we should take them together whenever possible in order to have the most accurate understanding of the intentions of the resolution. Just like with electronic surveillance, it wasn't just they wanted surveillance and they just tacked on electronic just because they could. It was because they were hoping for a debate and styling the resolution toward a debate that was specifically on the topic or the subtopics of electronic surveillance.
Okay, that makes absolute sense. I agree.
Awesome. All right, we are going to hop really quickly into our phrase of the week, and this week our phrase is cross-apply. So this is something we do for debaters who are a little bit newer, who are listening to this show. Maybe it's a novice, or maybe it's someone who's second year, but maybe didn't quite get it all understood totally the first year,
or just forgot. I forget
or that
stuff.
too. And cross-applying or cross-application is whenever you take an argument such as, say, a topicality argument, for example. Probably not the best instance, but just say in theory. A topicality argument which says that something is not substantial, that something is not changing anything, or maybe that it's another type of policy. It's not actually whatever the resolution may be. And you can take that argument and then apply it to another set of arguments. So basically get the judge to tag that as a separate argument, even though it's the same argument, but use it in other instances where it could be useful. An effective instance of this would be perhaps where you have cards which address multiple arguments in that one card. And so you could read that card and argue it under a certain issue, under a certain tagline, and then you could say, Judge, now let me also cross-apply this argument to another stock issue if it applies, saying, for example, that certain policy wouldn't solve for something or certain policy doesn't work, or if maybe that argument within it applies to another issue later on, such as a disadvantage. Say the card says, this plan won't work and it'll actually kill 1 million people. Well, that would be a big issue. And not only does it not work as a solvency issue, it also creates a massive disadvantage. So that would be an instance of where you could encourage the judge to cross-apply that argument by just taking that tagline and applying it in both places on their flow. That can be very useful for keeping the judge sort of in touch with the arguments you're making and the scope of the arguments you're making, because I think as debaters, it's very easy to read lots and lots of information and forget to actually take each issue and each point out of those cards and out of everything you're presenting and spread it out so that you can see really the scope of, okay, this plan doesn't solve, this plan's not significant, this plan's not topical, this plan has massive disadvantages, and it's not just an issue here. We could also win on it here, Judge, even if you don't think, okay, you think maybe it could solve anyway, but it's still a disadvantage, and either way, we have to address it. So that's the phrase of our week, cross-apply or cross-application. Okay, so now we are transitioning over to talk about something very interesting. So Matthew Gray over at Impact Debate has a case talking about the United Nations and some details with that. Without giving too much away, because people do need to pay to get this, Matthew, would you like to just kind of tell everyone listening a little bit about this case and maybe encourage them to check it out?
Thanks. We've all, heard the headlines and seen the hot takes on Trump going back and forth with the UN and Ambassador Haley having beef with countries at the UN, and about how we spend a lot of money in aid for countries that don't support us, in global politics, specifically at the UN. So what we did was we took that basic idea of that U.S. aid should foster support for our policies in the global political arena. And so what we talk about in this case is we talk about that there's a history of countries that receive significant amounts of foreign aid from the United States not supporting us in the UN, and that the U.S. has been content, to play by those rules and to not tie any strings to that kind of aid and not put any conditions on it, even though we put lots of other conditions, over 400 actually, that go with our aid that is given out. So what we talk about is the significance. We talk about how this impacts the U.S. in foreign policy in other countries, how it impacts our standing in global politics, and how it actually can lead to disadvantages in international law for the United States. And so what this plan does is it puts together a couple of different aspects that will allow the U.S. through our ambassador at the UN to use kind of a carrot and stick approach in order to sway more support for the U.S. in global politics by leveraging our aid and turning that aid into support and votes in the UN forum.
These
Awesome.
are some very, very juicy nuggets right here, and it's very well put together. I especially like the
I
carrot
agree.
and stick, the carrot and stick thing you go over. I'm looking at it
Right.
right now.
So basically, lead other countries to support us in the way we want. So I have a few questions on this case. First and foremost, I think as someone coming from the more libertarian perspective of this, what do you say to the argument that we should cut funds to the UN or to the to some of these countries that we give aid to, regardless of whether or not they support us? The argument that essentially they're going to do what's in their best interest, we need to do what's in ours, and we should just cut ties right now. What do you say to that argument?
Sure, that's a valid argument, and I anticipate that coming up a lot and spurring some great debate. The counter argument from the affirmative would be, why do we want to abandon this position of leverage? You know, a lot of these countries are strapped for cash, and a number of areas are deep in debt and depend heavily on the money that the U.S. provides. So instead of just giving it to them with very little strings attached as far as what they can do in the international setting as far as supporting us, why not use this money as leverage in order to gain their support, or at least get them to stop opposing us so verbally? You know, if there's actually consequences that come from opposing us, then they might have to think twice before doing so, and it might give us a better standing internationally in the global, political atmosphere.
Definitely.
I have a real quick
Why
question.
Oh, go ahead.
Steven, you can go ahead. Mike can wait.
Okay. Why in the first place is the U.S. funding organizations that oppose us? Is it more of a thing of we're just disorganized, so we don't really look into the details, or is there a legitimate fear of, I don't know, retaliation from the countries, or what's the reasoning in the current status quo?
Well, that's a pretty broad question because there are so many countries that we support that don't always, return the favor. So many countries that we're giving money that adamantly oppose us in the UN, and there's different reasons for those different specific cases. So you really have to take it on a case-by-case basis. It's rarely that we're just giving money away for the heck of it. There's usually always some sort of reason, and it kind of, we could reference the Palestine case we were discussing a little bit earlier, because a lot of times we put money just to try to support a precarious status quo. I could think of Egypt, which I think you guys have talked about on a podcast earlier, where we're giving money, kind of paying them off for keeping the peace with Israel, even though they do not always support us. And there's other examples too. We could talk about Pakistan. We could talk about some various other countries, but there's always a reason that the money's going there. Okay. But the problem is that we're not putting any conditions as far as support and return for that aid. And this kind of comes from the conservative perspective we were talking about earlier, which is that our foreign aid should further our interests and support our policy.
So basically, the idea that we buy Band-Aids rather than bullets.
Correct.
Awesome. Okay.
I was actually on that. I was wondering how would you respond to the argument that aid is not meant to be to our advantage. It's supposed to be, and this is not something I believe. It should solely be for helping other countries, and it's our responsibility because we're a really rich country to help other countries without putting a bunch of strings, without attaching a bunch of strings.
Sure. So the truth of the matter is, if we really look down into people's motivations, nobody does anything unless they think it benefits them in some way. Now, it may not be monetary, it may be moral, it may, help with their conscience sake that they're helping someone. So it may not be a monetary return, but everybody does something because they think it's in their best interest. Every decision we make, whether it's true or not, and whether we know the impact or not, is done because we think that it's in our best interest, whether it's to create a better political standing internationally, to assuage our conscience, or to actually get a return on investment. So what we need to decide is what is that benefit that we're looking for. And so with this case, we're saying the benefit, yes, it's aid because we're not asking them to pay us back. And that's the context that I think we can view this case through. Is it's still aid because we're still giving the money and they don't have to pay us back. It's not even that we're giving them a no interest loan. We're actually giving them the money with no monetary return, but we do want to benefit from it. And that benefit, the affirmative would be saying with this case, is to further our policy, or at least not shoot ourselves in the foot, as far as not spending money to damage our own reputation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome. I feel like I had another question, but I think that was such a good answer that my mind's just still pondering that. Stephen, I'm curious because I know you tend to have a lot of questions about this sort of thing. Does that pretty much sum up this case for you, or do you have any other questions or concerns when it comes to the United Nations?
For the most part, I would say it definitely sums it up. Without researching the case at all, just from a negative viewpoint, I feel like or maybe this is more of a question, Matthew, are there any legitimate arguments that the negative could make about retaliation from the UN or the U.S. getting in trouble for cutting off aid?
Oh, sure. We're working on the negative brief. I was hoping to get it out a little bit sooner, but we'll probably have it coming in the next, within the next 2 months. I think there's some great arguments that could be made that it may not work, as far as a lot of these countries have a mind of their own, and if we cut off aid, they may just spite their, cut off their nose to spite their face, and just say, well, we don't care, we don't want your money anyway if it's going to have conditions on it. Now, the affirmative team could come back and say, well, that's great, because if they're not going to support us, then we don't want to spend the money on them. So you could have a debate about the effects and which are more important. There are also, I would anticipate, a lot of arguments on the non-binding nature of UN statutes, and though the affirmative brief has examples of where they do have real-life impacts, negative teams may argue that the majority of UN resolutions do not have lasting impacts because they are non-binding in nature. So there could be a lot of arguments in that regards, and there could be arguments that it could be an abuse of power by the ambassador, because I won't give away too much, but the case does give the ambassador quite a bit of leverage. And so some people may argue that the ambassador could be a loose cannon and maybe mess up everything. So I think there's definitely a lot of legitimate arguments, but I think it makes for a good debate to go back and forth because there's solid argumentation and solid evidence on both sides.
A final question before Stephen, do you have anything more to say?
I do not. You take it away,
Okay.
buddy.
Final question before we come off the UN case. Do you have examples, this would be significance, I believe, of the UN of, as you said, getting shot in the foot from our cash, just funding countries that don't like us? Do you have evidence here that of harms that are happening?
Some examples of harms that have happened.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we have a number of examples, especially with the UN Security Council, where they've passed resolutions against the United States. And I know recently one that was in the news was the change by President Trump to use Jerusalem as the headquarters for our ambassador, moving the ambassador to Israel to Jerusalem. We lost a lot of international standing because we had a lot of vocal opposition to that. We've also seen examples of territory disputes in the Ukraine, where we did not receive the support that we really needed. We could go all the way back to the 50s and talk about the attacks in Korea. But what I really like, some of the biggest impacts that I think go along with this, actually are down in our 2A evidence. If you're following along, it talks about where some arbitrators in cases have actually used UN resolutions to settle binding legal disputes, and even the U.S. Court of Appeals has given weight to some of the UN resolutions in deciding cases here at home. So I think those are real life impacts that can be drawn from unfavorable results in the UN that could have been changed if we had leveraged our foreign aid in order to garner more support.
Interesting, and that really takes it to it takes it home for a lot of people because it's actually sort of applicable all of a sudden. It's not just far off. And Matthew, quick question, sort of about impact debate. So, can people buy this brief individually, or do they need to get the membership? How can they find this?
Yeah, so if you're interested and piqued about this case and you want to know more, feel free to check out on our website under the publications page under memberships, because we do not offer these briefs on an individual basis. Because if we did, unfortunately, we would have to price it in a way that I don't think would be affordable for a lot of debaters. So what we do is we package it together, and for $45 you can get access to any of our briefs, any of our cases for the entirety of the season. And if you're interested in doing that, just go on our website. It's easy to find. Fill out the little form, and we can get the ball rolling and get you an Impact membership.
Fantastic.
Good deal.
All right. Moving down, I think, to our last topic of the day. This is the one that we sort of included in the description, that this is the case that Stephen and I won a tournament with, and now we are revealing it to you guys because this case is basically dead now. So, okay.
Basically dead.
We call this the Cameroon case, or the Cameroon Leahy Laws application, because the gist here is summarizing all of this. So historically, there's two groups in Cameroon. There's the Francophones, the people who speak French, that were originally under French rule whenever Cameroon was a French colony. And there's the Anglophones, who speak English, who were under the English colony in that place at that point in time in the past. And these two groups basically hate each other. So what happens with that is the Francophones, who are more numerous, control the government and therefore oppress the Anglophones. And that's problematic because the government is essentially a dictatorship. It's not a very legitimate president. The president apparently has puppet elections every so many years, and the military, his spec ops groups, come out and patrol the streets and basically shut everything down and intimidate people into voting for him every time there's an election. So not a very nice guy, not a very legitimate government there. And it's used by the Francophones to historically oppress Anglophones, again, like I stated. And what that led to eventually was a bit of a civil war. And where that gets really dicey is what happened in response after the Civil War, after the Anglophones sort of protested and then their protest turned into sort of a civil war, was the military forces from the Francophones, controlled by the Francophone-led government, went full out on human rights abuses. They burned entire villages with people inside them, just arbitrarily, it seems. They would arrest people and kill them indiscriminately, arbitrarily, in mass sometimes. They would kill disabled people, people who had like autism, things like that, and weren't able to really take care of themselves. They would just execute them. There was lots of instances of torture, and this is really not the first time Cameroon's done this. It's a current issue right now, but it's been going on for longer than that. There was actually an instance, I think in around 2013, where actually on a U.S. Air Force drone base in Cameroon, the Cameroonian military was actually taking people that it had supposedly arrested and torturing them on a U.S. military base. So this is something that's well recorded. It's been going on for quite a while. There's a lot of satellite imagery and on-the-ground videos showing where the Cameroonian forces have gone in there and just done horrible things. And why this matters from a U.S. aid perspective is because the Cameroonian military, we basically propped up and trained using our special operators or special ops. We sent in military aid in the form of training and equipment. We continue to do so, I believe, although I think the scale is probably much smaller now. It's practically insignificant, which is why we're dropping the case, because we recently pulled troops out of Cameroon due to a strategic change in the region. But
real quick,
basically,
I'm just wondering, why did we start training them? Like, what was the reason back then?
right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of terror on the border with Nigeria. There's a group called Boko Haram, which is infamous for basically kidnapping women and girls and putting them into slavery, which is really a horrible thing. And we went in there for the right reason, to help the military fight that terrorist group. But what ended up happening was, shortly after we trained them, the government reallocated a lot of the military forces to oppressing Anglophones once that sort of civil war occurred quite recently. And it's really just gotten much worse since then. And the military actually came out and said, regardless of those sort of instances, they were going to continue providing aid until recently. A strategic change is what actually caused our 300 or so military spec ops on the ground to move out of that country. Although I'm not sure about whether or not we still can continue to provide equipment to the military or not.
Right, we actually do. We still provide military equipment and training. We just don't have soldiers on the ground.
So it's
Since
not,
we no longer have...
it's not a completely dead case, but it's not one that's super backed up.
It's really hard to really justify the case now, because it's so minute since we've basically pulled out, and there's really not much left here. But the reason, coming full circle, the reason why this was a good case was under the Leahy laws, which are these laws we talked about, I think, last week on the podcast, where the U.S. military, the Department of Defense, and the Department of State are barred from giving any support legally to militaries that are caught up in gross violations of human rights. Those could be indiscriminate killings, extrajudicial killings, torture, forced disappearances, rape. Basically, all of those things are happening in Cameroon by the military. And if we know that those militaries are doing things like that, and if we recognize it, then we cannot continue giving support. And the case for this was so strong that the U.S. ambassador to Cameroon actually threatened the government that we might need to invoke these laws if they didn't do something about it. And they basically recognize the fact that it's happening, but they're not really doing that much about it, because the whole government is corrupt. The president is basically a dictator. So you cannot expect things to just change just from threatening, oh, we'll cut off some funds. So our plan would enforce the laws it's written. It would recognize the violations of human rights, and it would arguably take care of this. We did pretty well with it. We lost one round really on a topicality press, and that was that we're not reforming anything because we just pulled out troops. And this evidence came out that we had just pulled out troops literally a matter of weeks after the military said they weren't pulling out troops. So the military flipped.
Like 2 days before a tournament.
Right. So the military flipped their position, all of a sudden started pulling out troops, and a team got to that the second day of the tournament. after our case was revealed. And so we lost that round, but we still ended up winning the tournament with the case, which was really fortunate. And we won't be running this case again. But that's our case. I'm curious, Stephen, any thoughts you have on this? It was a fun case, but
it was
really
definitely a fun case. There's probably been 7, 8 cases that Christian and I could have made this year just based off of the same principle with invoking the Leahy Law on countries that violate, have gross human rights violations. But if you ever do go up against this case, a couple of things to watch out for. You definitely want to have a card or two on the whole point with inherency and definitely drive that in. Another little point that you could attack is, this one probably isn't the best point. You probably don't want to make it your pinpoint or main argument, but granted, the Cameroonian government, the Francophones, are very evil men with all the stuff that they do. However, they aren't per se the only guilty ones. The separatists, or the Anglophones are also called the separatists, have done quite a bit of stuff in retaliation, killing a lot of soldiers, kidnapping a lot of teachers and school students and government officials, doing huge military strikes, stuff like that. So in a way, I could definitely see this happening. You can make an argument that although what the Cameroonian government is doing isn't acceptable, it's not completely unjustifiable, because all they're doing is trying to keep peace, trying to fight against the civil war that the separatists are starting and are attacking. So be careful with that. Don't excuse the evil acts that the government has done, but just the argument can definitely be made from that. Another argument you can be made is that by the U.S. just pulling out and, turning their backs on Cameroon, they're not fixing the problem that we made in the first place by training the special ops. So in that way, nothing will ever happen. Most teams that I heard of, and Christian and I ourselves, we ran a justification case, so we never claimed to be solving a problem. But you can always argue to the judge that nothing good will happen. We're just allowing the, how do you pronounce it, Christian? The Bataillon d'Intervention?
Basically just the BIR.
The BIR.
Bataillon d'Intervention Rapide.
That one. We're not solving anything. So that's another argument. We're just washing our hands clear of it. And those are actually, this is a pretty good case in the fact that those are the only ones I've really heard of.
Right. From the affirmative perspective, one of the tough things is you have to show, and it's actually not that tough because it's pretty well documented, you have to show that historically the Civil War is irrelevant. Cameroon is just oppressive of human rights, and you have to argue that basically the government's horrible and they do horrible things on a routine basis, which is generally true from what I've seen. But from the negative, they're going to say, well, this is a lot of these instances that you're citing as the basis for your case. They are coming out of a civil war. So there is some sort of exemption, you could say, that applies to the Leahy laws during armed conflicts or during civil uprisings, where basically the government, while it may not necessarily be good that they're doing these things, they have a little bit of leeway whenever there's something happening and they're in the heat of the moment. You can't necessarily be as accountable in the heat of the moment whenever you're defending yourself against what is essentially a civil war, as you can during just everyday operation. So that's the argument that the negative is going to make. I think it's a strong argument based off a legal standpoint. The other argument against this case is that it's not a huge change in policy to enforce the laws it's written, and it shouldn't be considered a huge change in policy. And I think that's not a bad argument whatsoever. In fact, I would actually, if I was a negative and I was running against something based on human rights, we've actually won based off just invoking the Leahy laws as a minor repair. So that was a good argument against the case. I'm not sure we managed to win with it either way, as a minor repair or a substantial reform. But that's sort of a lot of it depends on how you argument. Matthew, I know you need to go soon, so I'll be respectful of that. But before you go, what are your thoughts on the Leahy laws and the broader application that we can take away from this?
I think your use of it as a minor repair is really a genius move because, like you said, it's not if we take that law as it is on the books, you could apply this to most any humanitarian rights cases where they're going to discontinue aid, and just show there's already existing policy that we need to enforce. The flip side could be, people arguing against that, is that just because something's on the books doesn't mean it's actual effective policy. There are lots of laws on the books that aren't necessarily enforced, and if something isn't an effective policy, wouldn't it be therefore a significant change to actually create a policy that works and a policy that is recognized and efficient? So I think it makes for a great debate, and I would especially encourage negative debaters to read up on that and use it as a great general argument that is very applicable.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you, Matthew, for
Agreed.
joining us on this podcast. It's been
Yeah.
a really great discussion. And definitely, if you're listening to this, check out Impact Debate Coaching. They have a lot of great stuff, and I can't wait to work out getting all of our membership stuff taken care of with that. But again, thank you, Matthew, for joining us. It's been fun.
Well,
Yep.
thanks for having me. It's been a great time.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, I think, and we can cut the audio there, and then
Deal.
once Matthew goes, we will go ahead and patch up any weird stuff with where the audio cut off.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. Again, it's been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for
this
having me.
was fun.
All right, you have a great day, Matthew.
You too, guys. Take care.
All
All
right,
right,
see ya.
bye-bye.
This ends the third episode of the Team Policy Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to see us on our social media, we have the Team Policy Facebook profile, and we release these episodes weekly. If you'd like to contact us, send us a brief case or anything of interest that you'd like us to comment or review, either on the show or not, you can email us at teampolicypodcast@gmail.com. I'll say it again, that's teampolicypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening and have a good day.